Hello, my name is Meredith Carter, and this is my signature project, Stage 2, for my Master's in Elementary Education at the University of West Alabama. In a previous course, my ED 504 course, I designed this research proposal and action plan that addressed the issue of poverty. I sought to study the impact that poverty makes on student academic achievement because in my personal teaching experience, I have seen that many of my students live in poverty, and the fact that they live in poverty is seeming to negatively impact their academic performance. And I wanted to make my research study based on that so that I could really see and learn more about whether or not the impact of poverty has a negative effect on student academic achievement. So, to explain a little bit to you about my research study, like I said, it seeks to identify the statistical impact that poverty has on student academic achievement. And my research question was, what impact does poverty have on student academic achievement? So I'm going to share with you some of the original data that helped me identify this problem, and I'm going to do this through some graphics. So at the end of my research proposal, I attached a few graphics that helped me identify a problem and helped me better understand what I was studying. So the first information that I want to share with you is this graph right here. So you'll see in this graph that at my school, 16% of the students that are at the school I teach at receive free and reduced lunch, which I used as a qualifying factor to identify which students were living in poverty. If a student was on free and reduced lunch, I also considered that student to be living in poverty. In the state of Alabama, 50% of our students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. Those facts were alarming to me. In addition to that, this graphical representation shows the language arts proficiency percentages of the students in Shelby County schools where I teach and in the state of Alabama as a whole. Only 59% of students in Shelby County schools were deemed proficient on the language arts test and 46% for the Alabama state average. I also presented some information related to poverty rates and how those are impacted by age and gender. So I found that students in the ages either 0 to 5 and then between 6 and 11 experience high rates of poverty. About 8.33% of the population for whom poverty is determined is in Shelby County when it's for the state of Alabama. So that was very concerning to me. Another chart or graphical representation of data that helped me identify the problem of poverty was that in schools where students are consistently high performing, only 1.1% of high poverty schools are considered a school where students can perform highly on a consistent basis. And only 24% of low poverty schools have consistent high performance. So that right there led me to believe that perhaps poverty does make a negative impact on student academic achievement. I also saw that poverty impacts cognitive functions in the brain. So students that are living in poverty are negatively affected in their language abilities, their working memory, cognitive control, reward processing, their memory, their spatial cognition, and their visual cognition. So that very much alarmed me and made me believe that if students are experiencing physical setbacks and emotional setbacks, psychological setbacks due to their poverty, it's hard to believe that that doesn't negatively affect their academic performance as well. The last aspect of data that I used to guide my research and also to help me identify my problem was the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This research-based theory from Maslow shares that students and individuals in general must have their physiological needs like food, water, rest met first before other needs like self-actualization needs or esteem needs are met. And learning, I believe, is a creative activity that's at the higher point of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, which means that if students living in poverty don't even have some of their physiological and safety needs met, According to Maslow, it's going to be difficult for them to actually achieve academically and meet their self-actualization needs. So those are some of the graphical representations that helped me find my data, helped me identify the problem, and helped me select this topic. Now, for my background investigation of the topic, I researched a variety of different pieces of literature. I'm going to go to this part in my proposal. Sorry, it's very long. Okay, so I researched a variety of different literature sources, and I looked to see what other research has been done on the impact of poverty on student academic achievement. Some of the data I did just share with you through the charts, but there are a few more facts that I want to share with you. According to the National Center for Children in Poverty, about 15 million children in the United States live in low-income homes or in poverty. That means 43% of children live through poverty, which is a large amount. In the school district in which I teach, 16% of our students are on free and reduced lunch, like I shared with you, and in Alabama, 50% of the state is on free and reduced lunch. Some of the other literature that I mentioned is Eric Maslow's studies and research on the hierarchy of needs. I also looked into some research on how students living in poverty are given federal funds to help improve their scores and just their quality of schooling. And I noticed that through my literature review of that students that are receiving interventions are mostly just students with special needs or students that have an IEP or 504 plan. Students that are living in poverty, however, don't receive specific interventions to help them cope with the negative side effects and negative setbacks to their life in poverty. So to explain to you my sampling procedure and really my action plan as a whole for this research, I'm going to walk you through the procedures, my sampling method, my instrumentation, who I collaborated with, and talk to you a little bit about the validity of my research. All right. So to explain my method and my research as a whole, this experimental research plan that I used was a quantitative format of data collection that included a control group of students who did not receive interventions and another group of students that did receive interventions. Academic tests in the study or in the subject of English language arts will be given to both a control group and another group of students in my study. Both groups will be students that have been statistically determined to be living within poverty limits using their qualification for free and reduced lunch to decide that. The control group will take the initial academic reading test and their scores will be recorded. The experimental group will also take the initial academic test and their scores will be recorded also. The control group will follow the normal schedule of school instruction and then be given a post-test to determine how their scores compared from pre-test and post-test after a set period of time. The experimental group, on the other hand, will be given the same pre-test for reading that the control group got, but then during that time span in between the pre-test and the post-test, my experimental group will receive research-based reading interventions from a teacher in a small group setting. This group will then, at the same time as the control group, take their post-test, that same post-test for reading. Test scores will be analyzed to determine if the group that received interventions improved their reading scores more sufficiently than the control group did. If the students living in poverty that received interventions outperform the students in the control group that didn't get interventions, it will be determined that poverty does impact student academic achievement and that interventional support can lessen the negative impact. So those are my procedures and my steps of my research study. The population of students that I'll be looking at for this study will consist of all students in grades 3 through 5 at Helena Intermediate School. Most specifically, those students will all be living in poverty based on their qualification for free and reduced lunch. My sampling procedures were purposeful. It was purposeful sampling because I purposely chose 50 students within grades 3 through 5 at my school to use in this study. The students, like I said, will be split into two groups, an experimental group and a control group. There will be 25 students in each group, and that selection of who is in which group was random so that there was no bias there. I assigned my students a number between 0 and 25 for each group so that there are no identity characteristics that can be linked to this study. The students in my study will not be exposed to much risk. It involved minimal risk to the participants, and an informed consent form is also going to be obtained from every parent or guardian since my students are minors. I did the random assignment of numbers to protect their identity, and I also gave my students and their parents the ability to withdraw from this study at any time. To address the validity of my study, while there always are possible considerations related to internal validity, the same grade level of iReady reading diagnostic tests will be used for both my control group and my experimental group to help maintain that internal validity. The test that we're using is called an iReady reading assessment. This is also a very reliable instrument that is used for data collection at schools across the nation. Some of the collaborative resources and efforts that take place in this study are that classroom educators that are teaching students involved in the study are going to be the biggest collaborator. School administrators and content area coaches will also collaborate for this study to help ensure that the small group interventions that are provided are given at appropriate times, the same time across all students in the study, and that the standards that they're teaching are also in alignment with Alabama Learning Exchange state standards. The students that are receiving the interventional support will get 30 minutes a day of that intervention group. All students in both the control group and experimental group will still get their same amount of regular general education instruction during the day as well. Some of the limitations of this study are that some things will be out of the researcher's control. For example, if students are absent from school for a few days, if one teacher does not give the exact same interventions as another teacher, or for perhaps if any of the students, either in the control or experimental group, are not there to take the iReady post-test at the end of the study, that would mean that I could not use their data for my study. But hopefully by working collaboratively with the parents of the students, the learning partners at school, and the students, there will be great reliability, validity, and control within the experiment. I want it to yield valid results. So I've already addressed confidentiality, how I'll keep that intact for my study. And I also want to say, in relation to special populations, students that are already receiving services for special education or another type of service at school will not take part in my study, even if they are living in poverty, because I don't want any external variables to affect my external validity for this study. My study is in alignment with all of the IRB guidelines, so my students have a choice to join or leave. No information is given out on their personal identity, and the students are also not going to be deceived during any part of this study. I do want to connect my action plan to how I expect student achievement to look like. So I expect that if this research proposal were to be conducted, that I would see student achievement growth if there was a certain change in my data. So if I noticed that the students in my experimental group that received interventions outperformed the students in the control group that took that same iReady assessment after the post-assessment, then I would see that poverty does in fact impact students' academic achievement negatively, but that interventions can increase the student academic achievement of students living in poverty. So that's one change in data that would help me learn something. Also, if a change in data in which my students in my control group who received the pre and post test but no interventions, if their scores did not improve or they decreased, that would also show me that students living in poverty experience negative impacts on their student academic achievement, and they need some type of additional support like an intervention to help them better perform. If I were to conduct this study again, I would most definitely change a few little things. The first thing would be that I would choose a larger sampling population. I have about 900 students at the school in which I teach in grades 3 through 5. So I chose 50 students for this initial research proposal because I felt like that was a manageable amount. But with the variables of students possibly missing school or being absent, things that I can't control, if I were to do this again, I would choose 150 students for this study. 50 students per grade living in poverty that I could analyze instead, so that I would have a larger population sample to work with. I also would choose to give the teachers that were collaborating with this study a specific intervention plan to use with the experimental group students, so that every student was getting the exact same interventions during their 30 minutes of small group a day. And I would use the iReady intervention plan for that, so that it aligned with the iReady pre and post test. A little bit of background information that helped me come up with my study and also guided some of my thinking during this was the fact that I used to be an intervention teacher. And while I was an intervention teacher, a lot of the students that I taught, since I was at a Title I school, were living in poverty. And those students were underperforming academically and struggling. However, if I worked with those students consistently, which I did, and I assessed them every 2 weeks, I saw student growth for over 80% of my students living in poverty, due to the fact that they were receiving 30 minutes a day of interventions with me. So while that's just one example, and that's just my personal experience, so that doesn't guide my whole study, but that does help me see, and it helped me decide some of the intervals, some of the variables for my study. And I also compared that with a lot of the data and research and the literature I was able to find from other research that have conducted this, or other researchers that have conducted studies on the same topic. So I hope that as I've described all of this, it's clear what my research study was and how I would conduct it if I were to actually do it. I would hope that my results would have an outcome, that would prove that students living in poverty do experience negative impacts on their student academic achievement, and that something like an intervention small group would help them be able to better perform academically in the classroom. But I would be very curious to see what the data actually results in. If I were to try to think of any additional research that could be done on this topic to improve student achievement, I would hope that other researchers would address some of these future needs of students living in poverty, and would look for ways to help provide students with supports at school that help counteract the negative impacts that poverty causes, to bridge that gap between poverty and achievement. So I hope that other researchers will also conduct studies similar to mine, and I am excited to see those when they come out. So thank you for listening. Bye-bye.